with Will. The next time I tell you to stop and you don't, I'll take a shot at you. Knute Austin was a brother to Bishop Austin of Liberty, who was the man Robert Kunz had earlier delivered the Liberty mail to on foot each day. By this time, William J. and Annie had 2 children, Benjamin William and Mabel. Robert Smith tells of helping to deliver the cows that fall to Lake Town and Meadowville. He said he drove 50 to 60 head of cows up Antelope Flat alone, and then down Indian Creek and along the east side, going south around the end of Bear Lake. He left October 7th, and the first night they camped north of South Eden, and it snowed 6 inches that night. William J. and Annie moved back to Bern in the fall to winter, and Robert went back to Paris for the winter. When John and David were called on their missions in October of 1884, William J. was 19 years old and Johnny was only 15 years old, and both were living at home, or at least in the John Kunz III home in Bern. They were both helping with the affairs at home to keep things going while John served in Switzerland. When William J. married Annie Schmid in the spring of 1887, Johnny was now 18 years old. We need to visit John William, alias John Kunz Jr., alias Uncle Johnny, for a few minutes. I'm going to call him Johnny. Johnny was some shorter than William J. When you compare the physical description of Johnny as given in Foster M. Kunz's history of John Kunz Jr. and Mary Schmid with those given of his mother, Magdalena Strawbar, in Uncle George's book, History of Bern, you find Johnny and his mother to be of a very similar stature and size. Now, if you compare Sophie Strawbar's picture and Johnny's photo, you can see that Johnny drew his mortal genes from the Strawbar gene pool. You can easily see which family line he came from. Johnny is described as being both gentle and generous. In the words of his mother, Magdalena, she said about Johnny, "In the year of 1869, on July 14th, another son was born unto me, who was a sickly child, and if it would not have been for the faith and prayers of his parents and the elders, no doubt would have passed away. But having great promises made to him through the elders, great things were promised unto him for this life's journey, and he grew up to be a healthy boy." Johnny immigrated with his family and lost his mother through death before he was 5 years old. Johnny spent 3 years in the Ovid-Bern area, and at age 8, his father John moved the family to the old Phelps Ranch at Pegram. He helped his father as he grew, doing things that a boy of his age could do. 5 years later, at age 13, the family moved back to Bern, and Johnny was getting to be more help in his father's dairy and cow herding operation. John received his mission call in 1884 when Johnny was only 15. By then, Johnny was doing a man's work, and he and William J. were able to keep up John's end of the operation. At this time, Johnny was learning and polishing the arts needed for his trade, like leatherwork, horsemanship, cattle handling, and the making of cheese. When John returned from his mission in 1886 and served in the Logan Temple for another 2 years, Johnny stayed at the place with William J. and looked after his father's operation. Johnny was now 19. When John returned in 1888, he and Dave were gearing for the move to Williamsburg and more open range with renewed opportunity. In 1889, Robert Smith said he was working part-time for William J., herding cows and milking them, and making cheese in Bern, and at the Taylor Ranch east of Paris. He says that fall he helped William J. return cows to the communities along the west side of the lake. He says that during the winter of 89 and 90, some of the Kunzes, including Johnny and Lizzie, would come to their place in Paris during the days of quarterly state conference. He indicated they had a good time and enjoyed themselves on those occasions. In 1889, John II, William J. and Johnny's grandfather, was struggling with health problems and was deteriorating rapidly. He had struggled for a time with malaria, which had ruined his kidneys, causing him to suffer with dropsy. John died on the February 16th, 1890. Then in the spring of 1890, William J. says he gathered cows and left Bern and took them down on the Hubble on Bear River and milked and made cheese. According to Robert Smith's journal, this was somewhere in the Pegram area. John, Will's father, was busy establishing the upper dairy at Williamsburg. Johnny was now 20 years old, still single, and I believe Johnny was still working with William J. because Robert Smith said that the Geneva property was owned by both William J. and Johnny. William J. says in his history that he had a house built in Bern in the summer of 1887, right after he and Annie married. Then he says that in 1891 he traded his Bern property for a place in Geneva, and we moved up there in the spring where we made cheese during the summer. Then in the fall, we, meaning Will, Annie, and Johnny, moved to the Stookie claim on the Bear Lake bottoms and made cheese there until late in the fall. William J. continues in his autobiography that on January 1st, 1892, we had the misfortune of having our home burned down, which we rebuilt. On February 16th, 1892, their second daughter, Sylvia, was born, giving William J. and Annie 3 children, 1 boy and 2 girls. William J. and Johnny were feeding cattle for the winter of 91 and 92 for J.U. Stookie. That is why they moved in the early fall from Geneva to the Bear Lake bottoms. Comments in Robert's journal indicate that Johnny was still with William J., as Robert Schmid says that he was working for Bishop Robert Price at his shingle mill, and on July 4th, 1891, he and Henry Tusher borrowed 2 horses from Bishop Price and rode up Montpelier Canyon, which was just a narrow wagon road. We visited with William J. and family and Johnny Kunz when they lived at what is now known as the Chris Hershey place by the Big Spring on the west side of the valley, now Geneva. Henry Tusher bought part of this ranch that William J. and Johnny owned at one time and made good on it. We left home at 3 a.m., spent the day with our folks, had a good time, and got home after dark, good and tired. Then in the spring of 1892, William J. says, I traded my Geneva holdings for the place on Lanes Creek in Williamsburg, and we moved out to the Middle Dairy, where Johnny and I, with our families, made cheese during the summer. At the time of that trade, Johnny was still single. Johnny apparently had an ownership interest in the Geneva holdings as well as the Middle Dairy. A year after Will and Johnny got to the Middle Dairy, in 1893, Johnny was able to trade his uncle Samuel for the Lower Dairy because Samuel had decided to move his families to Salem, Idaho, north of Rexburg. Samuel, being tired of the separation from his families, with him at the lower dairy and some still living at Pegram, and Samuel being tired of running from the law, decided to give up the lower dairy and his Pegram holdings and move his family and cheese-making operation to Connet Creek, about 30 miles northeast of Salem, Idaho, and about 20 miles north of Teton Basin. When Johnny traded for the lower dairy, it would have been late in the fall after the cheese-making season of 1893. In September of 1894, there was a big strike on the railroad, so David Hershey quit. He could have returned as a fireman, requiring David to spend long periods away from home. David said, "I was afraid to raise a family and let the children run around and do nothing." In September of 1894, David went to the Snake River Valley in Idaho to see what he could find. He liked what he saw and secured 80 acres of sagebrush-covered ground in Salem. He then went back to Montpelier and prepared to move. I'm sure Samuel's move to the Salem area the previous year impacted David's decision to move his family over there. When David moved his family to Salem, Idaho, he says, "I shipped the furniture on the railroad and we went by team in a 3¼ inch wagon. There was myself, my wife, our 2 boys, my mother, my brother John, Rudolph Dubach, Christian Betschner, Wilford Kunz, my sister's boy, and Rudolph Lolliger, or 10 of us in a covered wagon. It took us 4 days from Montpelier to Salem." So David took his mother, Grandma Hershey, and Wilford Kunz, Jacob and Susanna's son, and his brother John with him when he moved his family to Salem in the Snake River Valley in October of 1894. After only 1 year there, John did not like the area, so in 1895 John and Grandma Hershey moved back to Bear Lake, and it was at this time that David took custody of Wilford. David says in his journal that Grandma Hershey gave Wilford to him before she and John moved back to Bear Lake, and I have kept him until this present time. He is now 51 years of age. Wilford lived with his Uncle David Hershey and Aunt Magdalena Hershey until he had reached the age of about 51, and David was 73 years old. The 1940 census shows Wilford still living in the David and Magdalena Hershey home in 1940. The cornerstone for the new Idaho Falls Temple was laid by President David O. McKay on October 26, 1940, and David, having always desired to live in close proximity to a temple, was getting his affairs in order to facilitate such a move. Arnold Benjamin, David and Magdalena's only son still living at home, married Rachel Rebecca Wiley on the 21st of December 1940, leaving no one at home to assist David and Magdalena with Wilford's care. David was 73 years old and Magdalena was close behind. So in February of 1941, David admitted Wilford as a patient in the Idaho State Hospital South in Blackfoot, Idaho, where Wilford lived out the remaining 5 years of his life. Then on April 5, 1941, David and Magdalena bought a house in Idaho Falls so he and Magdalena could make that desired move close to a temple and continue to do temple work for their kindred dead as they continued getting older. David and Magdalena moved to their home in Idaho Falls in June, of 1941. Wilford was admitted to the Idaho State Hospital as a patient suffering with psychosis with epilepsies and psychosis with mental deficiency. Webster describes Wilford's condition as having a loss of contact with reality, a psychiatric disorder such as schizophrenia or mania that is marked by delusions, hallucinations, incoherence, and distorted perceptions of reality. Wilford was also plagued with seizures, which Webster describes as sudden attacks of an illness or condition. Because Wilford had been afflicted from his birth, he also suffered from mental deficiency. Wilford died on April 28, 1946 at the Idaho State Hospital South of what was determined as cardiovascular disease, which is more commonly known as a heart attack. Wilford was buried in the Idaho State Hospital South Cemetery in an unmarked but known location. Arrangements have been made with the administration of that hospital, and monies have been paid to assure that Wilford's grave will be properly marked. I want to stop here and pay a tribute to David and Susanna Hershey. David was a brother of Susanna Hershey, Jacob Kunz's first wife, and Magdalena was a sister of Caroline Withrich, Samuel's second wife, and David and Magdalena took responsibility for Wilford, Jacob and Susanna's second son, who was orphaned at age 5 and a half